The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, but the darkness had already swallowed Gladewater, Texas. It was a chilly November night, and the air felt heavy with the kind of silence that only small towns can muster. At the edge of town, the Mint Club was just starting to buzz with life. Inside, a group of locals were setting up for the night, and outside, a few cars had already parked, their engines still warm from the day's journey. Elvis Presley, a young and unknown singer from Memphis, was about to step into the club for his first performance in Texas. He was nervous, but not just because of the crowd. He had a bad feeling, a sense that something was off. Maybe it was the way the road had twisted and turned on the way to Gladewater, or maybe it was the way the sky had darkened so quickly. Whatever it was, it made his stomach churn. Elvis had arrived with his band, the Blue Moon Boys, just a few hours earlier. They had driven through the night, their car barely holding together, and they were tired. Scotty Moore, the guitarist, was already tuning his instrument, and Bill Black, the bassist, was checking the stage. Elvis, however, was pacing around the back of the club, trying to shake off the unease. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air. It was the sound of a car crash, and it came from just outside the club. Elvis's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the door and pushed it open, just in time to see a car skid across the parking lot and crash into a tree. The impact was brutal, and the car crumpled like a tin can. Smoke started to rise from the wreckage, and the sounds of breaking glass and metal filled the air. Without thinking, Elvis sprinted toward the car. He could see two people inside, a man and a woman, both unconscious. The man was slumped over the steering wheel, and the woman was crumpled in the passenger seat. Elvis yanked open the door and tried to pull the man out, but the man was stuck. The car had wrapped itself around the tree, and the metal was twisted and bent. "Scotty, Bill, help me," Elvis shouted, his voice shaking. His bandmates ran over, and together they started to pry the man free. It was a struggle, and the car was starting to smoke more heavily. They finally managed to pull the man out, but the woman was still trapped. Elvis crawled into the car trying to reach her, but the seat belt was jammed. He could hear her gasping for air, and his heart was pounding in his chest. "Don't worry, I'm going to get you out," Elvis said, his voice low and calm. He reached over and tried to unbuckle the seat belt, but it wouldn't budge. He looked around, desperate for a tool, and spotted a piece of metal that had come loose from the car. He used it to pry the belt open, and finally the woman was free. He dragged her out of the car and carried her to safety, just as the car started to catch fire. The crowd that had gathered around the club was in shock. They had come to see a young singer perform, but they had witnessed a life-saving rescue. Elvis, covered in dirt and sweat, held the woman in his arms, making sure she was breathing. The man, who was now conscious, thanked him profusely. "Are you okay?" Elvis asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke. The man nodded, still in a daze. "Thank you, son. You saved our lives." Elvis managed a weak smile, just doing what anyone would do. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a moment of clarity, a moment when he realized that he could make a difference, not just with his music, but with his actions. The night was just beginning, and he had already proven that he was more than just a singer. He was a hero. The crowd started to applaud, and Elvis felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. It was a mix of fear, adrenaline, and a strange sense of purpose. He had a feeling that this night would be the start of something big, something that would change his life forever. As the band started to play and the crowd began to dance, Elvis stepped onto the stage. He took a deep breath, and as the music started, he let it all out. His voice was raw, his movements were wild, and the audience was electrified. They didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the birth of a legend. One morning, Tom Perriman, a DJ, got a call from his friend Tillman Franks. "Got someone I think you might like," Tillman said. "Not many records, but what there is gold. You should have heard the girls screaming their heads off at the hayride." Tom, intrigued, told Tillman he knew a place on Tyler Highway where they could bring this mystery guy. There's no stage fence, but the bands hardly ever get hit with beer bottles anymore, even if they stink. And that's how Texas welcomed Elvis to the Lone Star State. But it wasn't exactly a grand entrance. Elvis snuck in the back door in Houston, where no one remembered his music or his fuzzy face. When Elvis stepped off the Greyhound bus, he looked like he'd been on the road for days. Starved, exhausted, and wrinkled beyond recognition, he even smelled like someone who had been sleeping in a car for a while, which, in truth, he was. In Shreveport, the agent who was supposed to book gigs for Elvis and his band, the Blue Moon Boys, suddenly got blacklisted by the clubs. The band found themselves stranded in Louisiana with very little money, no place to stay, and few prospects. Some friends from the hayride helped them out with a few gigs around town to earn some gas money and the occasional hamburger. Then Tillman Franks found a job for them in Glade Water. They had just enough money left to put Elvis on the bus and pay for gas to get Scotty and Bill to East Texas with all the equipment. Tom Perriman and his friend Hal Long met Elvis at the bus station. He wasn't hard to spot. Shockingly dressed anorexics wouldn't come into fashion for several decades. They took Elvis to the Green Hut Cafe to get him something to eat. While Elvis chowed down on a burger, Hal took Elvis's prunified jacket to the dry cleaners. Tom checked Elvis into the Resmore Motel so he could get some rest and a hot bath before the show that night. A couple of hours later, Elvis reemerged, looking like a new man. He sauntered through the oil town and found his way to the Mint Club, a place that wasn't much to look at, but at least had a stage. A crowd propped up the bar, swilling long necks and jawing loudly. When Tom and Hal arrived, the situation hadn't changed. Elvis and the boys were jamming at record volumes, trying to drown out the conversations around them. Tom noticed a group of women crowding the stage, giving Elvis the once-over. Their enraptured expressions convinced Tom that he needed to tell a few of his fellow DJ about this guy. Maybe the kid had a future. At the break, the girls swarmed Elvis. He gave them autographed pictures for 50 cents and hugs for free. One bold young lady asked if she could take a picture with him. She just happened to bring her camera. Elvis agreed, but asked if he could get extra copies to send home to his mama. No problem. Tom, impressed, gave the musicians the entire evening's take instead of shaving his standard 25%. The boys wrapped up the concert and returned to the Resmore $90 richer. The next morning, while Scotty and Bill slept, Elvis strolled around town. He popped into the Roundup, a beer joint, to see what passed for entertainment in other parts of Gladewater, and later scored some barbecue at the Green Frog to sustain him through the long drive. After the show, girls could get "Love Ya, Elvis Presley" scrawled across his glossy 8x10 chest for 50 cents. Boys just got a yours. Elvis and the boys moved on to Houston, where the show was a success. Elvis wired his share of the proceeds home to his folks, complete with a telegram that read, "Hi babies, here's the money to pay the bills. Don't tell no one how much I sent. I will send more next week. There is a card in the mail. Love, Elvis." Meanwhile, Tom Perriman phoned a few contacts and made plans for Elvis to return to Gladewater at a more lively location. Elvis's first big break came in Texarkana, where a young man named Carl "Cheesy" Nelson became the first Elvis impersonator. Cheesy had a talent for impressions and often practiced in the local record store. One day, the store played a new record by a guy named Elvis Presley. The song, "That's All Right, Mama," was unlike anything Cheesy had heard before. He practiced the song until his rendition was perfect. Cheesy performed "That's All Right, Mama" at the Texarkana High School talent show, where he and his friend Pat Cupp wowed the crowd. A few weeks later, Elvis and the Blue Moon Boys were scheduled to perform at the Texarkana Municipal Auditorium. The night of the concert, Cheesy was asked to warm up the crowd with his Elvis impression. He agreed and performed "That's All Right, Mama" and "Blue Moon of Kentucky." When Elvis arrived, he joined Cheesy on stage for a duet, much to the audience's delight. After the concert, Elvis and Cheesy double dated, and they became fast friends. Cheesy often hitched a ride with Elvis whenever he played nearby shows. By the end of the year, Elvis would stop by Cheesy's father's filling station and ask if he wanted to catch a show in DeKalb or New Boston. But Cheesy's parents wouldn't let him travel to Shreveport to see the hayride, no matter how much Elvis asked. In December 1954, Elvis played at Hawkins High School. The school needed money for a class trip, and 3 enterprising students convinced Elvis to perform at their gym. When Elvis arrived, he joined the school's basketball team in a pickup game, easily scoring 20-plus points. After the game, Elvis and the Blue Moon Boys set up on a narrow platform and played to a packed gym. The crowd went wild, and Elvis's fame in East Texas continued to grow. Elvis's journey from a stranded singer in Louisiana to a rising star in Texas was just beginning. But one thing was clear. This kid had something special, and people couldn't get enough of him. That Friday night, the tiny oil town of Hawkins in East Texas came alive. It was a big deal, one of those rare moments when something exciting happened. Most folks in town didn't have TV yet, so they had to make their own fun. In that night, the fun was happening at the Humble Oil Recreation Hall. Doyle Stone, the town's star pitcher and a big Elvis fan, had managed to bring the young singer to Hawkins. He'd convinced Don Franks, a bigwig at Humble Oil, to let them use the rec hall for the show. For $1 a ticket, everyone in town and even some from neighboring villages came to see what all the fuss was about. Elvis and his band, Scotty Moore and Bill Black, arrived in their usual style. They were warmly welcomed by Doyle and his friends. Before the show, Elvis's girlfriend, Carolyn Bradshaw, was prepping in the girls' locker room, while the boys were getting ready backstage. The anticipation was electric. When Elvis finally stepped onto the stage, wearing his famous pink and black suit, the crowd went wild. He started with Hearts of Stone, and the place erupted. Girls screamed, boys cheered, and everyone was on their feet. The energy was so high that even the younger kids, who usually just laughed at the older ones' antics, were caught up in the excitement. After the show, Elvis signed autographs and posed for pictures. A student named Don Dearlam tried to record the performance with a new tape recorder, but the result was mostly static and screams. Despite the technical issues, everyone walked away with a memory they'd never forget. The next day, the town's Deacon Smith gave a fiery sermon about the devil's music and warned the youth about Elvis's sexual innuendos. But by then, everyone was already talking about the next show. Elvis's music was taking off. His latest single, The Milk Cow Blues Boogie, backed with You're a Heartbreaker, was selling like crazy. He was performing regularly on the Louisiana Hayride, a popular radio show that broadcasted across East Texas. The steady work gave Elvis and his band more exposure and a chance to hone their skills. In early January, Elvis played at the Grand Prize Saturday Night Jamboree in Houston. He sang I've Got a Woman and Baby Let's Play House, and the girls went wild. The next week, he and his band went on a whirlwind tour through West Texas, playing in Odessa, San Angelo, and Midland. They then headed back to East Texas for a show at New Boston High School on January 9th. The turnout was small but enthusiastic. The teenagers knew Elvis was something special, even if the music industry wasn't sure what to do with him yet. One of Elvis's shows that month was at the NCO Club, outside Texarkana. A 14-year-old babysitter named Jo Hawks was there with her employers. When Elvis saw her, he asked her to dance. Jo was taken with his unique style and his mesmerizing voice. After the show, Elvis asked for her phone number, and she gave it to him. A few days later, Elvis called Jo and invited her to a show in New Boston. Jo, despite having a jealous boyfriend, decided to go. They met at the show, and Elvis sang Harbor Lights to her. After the performance, they went to Keithley's Drive-In for a burger and a shake. The jukebox played That's All Right, Mama 7 times in a row, and Jo was both flattered and a little amused. Jo's boyfriend found out about the date and wasn't happy. When Elvis called again to ask Jo out, her mother told him Jo couldn't see him anymore. Jo never saw Elvis again, but she never forgot that night. Back in Hawkins, the oil town was buzzing with excitement. The winter tour was a huge success, and Elvis's fame was growing. Tom Perriman had booked him for more shows, including one in Tyler and another in Gilmer. The little rec hall in Hawkins was packed, and the crowd was so enthusiastic that they begged the band to play longer. The night was a success, and everyone left feeling like they'd been part of something magical. For a few hours, the worries of daily life in a small oil town were forgotten, and the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. Elvis and his band, the Blue Moon Boys, hit the road again after a whirlwind of concerts in Hawkins, Tyler, and Gilmer. The next stop was Longview, a city that promised a big crowd at the Rio Palm Isle Club, but things didn't go as planned. The club was known for its glamorous shows, but on this Thursday night it was nearly empty. Only about 160 people showed up, and most of them were friends of DJ Tom Perriman, who had invited them to support Elvis. The Hawkins kids, who usually followed Elvis everywhere, didn't make it to Longview. It was too far and too fancy for their budget. Elvis, Scotty, and Bill played their hearts out, but the small crowd didn't match the energy they were used to. After the show, Elvis walked around the club, chatting with the few people who stayed behind. One woman asked him how he was doing. He told her the truth. "If something doesn't happen pretty soon, I'm going to have to go back to driving a truck." Before they left, Elvis noticed the club owner's new Ford Crown Victoria, painted in a rare tropical rose color. He commented, "I sure do like the color of that car." Little did he know, the next time he saw the owner, he'd be driving a pink Cadillac. The next day, the band checked out of the Resmore Motel in Gladewater. The motel wasn't exactly the Ritz, and the owners were relieved to see them go. They had threatened to kick the band out several times because of their messy habits. But despite the rough patches, the boys were used to it. They were on the road, chasing their dreams. Their final stop was Joinerville, a small town with a big high school auditorium. They arrived at Gaston High School, tired but excited. The auditorium was packed with locals who had heard about the young singer from Memphis. The crowd was smaller than some of their previous shows, but the energy was electric. Elvis stepped onto the stage, and the audience erupted. He played his guitar, Scotty strummed his, and Bill's bass thumped out a steady rhythm. The kids from Hawkins were there, along with new faces who had heard the buzz. Elvis's voice, though strained from the previous nights, still managed to mesmerize the crowd. After the show, Elvis signed autographs and posed for pictures. The kids from Hawkins, who had followed him every step of the way, were thrilled. They knew they were witnessing something special, even if they couldn't put their finger on it just yet. Elvis and the band packed up their gear and headed back to Memphis. The East Texas tour was over, but the journey was just beginning. They had faced challenges, made new friends, and left a mark on the hearts of the people they met. And somewhere along the way, Elvis had found a little bit of himself too. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but one thing was clear: Elvis Presley was here to stay. The town of Joinerville, just a short drive from Henderson, was once the buzzing center of an oil boom. In the 1930s, Dad Joyner struck it rich with the Daisy Bradford No. 3, but eventually sold it to H.L. Hunt. By the 1950s, Joinerville had settled down, and its kids were sent to Gaston High School, which also took in students from nearby New London after a tragic explosion. At Gaston High, the band director, Wallace Reed, was always looking for ways to raise money. One day, some parents burst into his office with an idea. They had seen a young singer named Elvis Presley perform in Hawkins, and they thought he could draw a crowd. Elvis was new and exciting, and the parents believed he could help the school raise some much-needed cash. Reed was skeptical. He preferred classical music and had never heard of this Presley fellow. But he agreed to speak to the superintendent, Mr. Duran, and if everything checked out, they might just bring Elvis to Joinerville. Tom Perriman, who managed the band's bookings, penciled in a date for Elvis on January 28th. The East Texas tour would end in Joinerville, and the next day, Elvis would head back to Shreveport for a gig at the Louisiana Hayride. When Elvis, his guitarist Scotty Moore, and bassist Bill Black arrived in Joinerville, they were greeted by a small town with only a handful of businesses: a post office, a school, a barber shop, and a friendly "Y'all come back now" sign. Scotty and Bill dozed off in the car, but Elvis decided to explore. He wandered over to the high school, where he met Mr. Reed. The band director, impressed by Elvis's politeness, showed him around the school. They ended up in the band room, where Elvis played the piano and chatted with Reed. Reed was thrilled to learn that the concert had sold out, with over 600 tickets sold. Fire codes were more relaxed back then, so they didn't worry too much about the auditorium's actual capacity. Elvis was excited too. A full house meant a good paycheck, even after splitting it with his band and paying for records and posters. That evening, the auditorium was packed. Mr. Reed, Mr. Duran, their wives, and 600 teenagers waited eagerly. When Elvis took the stage, the quiet, well-mannered boy from earlier disappeared. He wore a pink suit and started to move in a way that had never been seen before. His head jerked, his hips swayed, and the audience went wild. The girls screamed, and Elvis fed off their energy, grunting and dancing like a man possessed. The performance was electric, and even Mr. Reed, who had been embarrassed by Elvis's movements, couldn't help but smile when he saw the superintendent's delighted expression. After the show, the students mobbed Elvis, wanting autographs and photos. Mr. Reed watched closely, thinking, "I wish I was his manager." He told Elvis that he believed he had real talent and would go far. Elvis, always polite, thanked him. Less than a year later, Elvis was a national sensation, performing on television and selling out venues across the country. Mr. Reed ran into Elvis in Houston and was surprised that the singer remembered their brief meeting. Elvis had a remarkable memory for faces and names. He asked if Reed had come to see the show, and the teacher, who hadn't even known Elvis was playing, was both impressed and a bit envious. Meanwhile, in February 1955, a Senate committee was busy blaming comic books for juvenile delinquency. But in Alpine, Texas, the real problem was that the lead act for a benefit concert hadn't shown up yet. John Nelson, the DJ from KVLF, had been working hard to bring in Elvis Presley, but as the clock ticked past 8 p.m., Elvis was nowhere to be found. The local talent was doing their best to keep the crowd entertained, but John was getting nervous. He called his boss, George Hendrick, who quickly joined the search. They drove out into the cold, dark night, scanning the gravel roads around Alpine. After several passes, they finally spotted Elvis, Scotty, and Bill, who were trying to revive their broken-down car. After some quick repairs, the trio managed to limp into town just in time for the show. Despite the late start and the small crowd, Elvis and his band delivered a powerful performance. The audience was electrified, and Elvis, fueled by adrenaline, gave it his all. John Nelson, who had started the evening worried, ended it amazed by the young singer's talent. After the show, Elvis signed autographs and even autographed the petticoat of the banker's daughter. He declined an invitation to a party, preferring to spend time with his new admirer. The next morning, Elvis and his band did an interview at the radio station and made plans to get their car fixed. They were booked for a gig in Carlsbad, New Mexico, thanks to a favor from a man named Colonel Tom Parker. This was the beginning of a long and sometimes complicated relationship. In Lubbock, the Lowe's, who owned the Cotton Club, became big fans of Elvis. They booked him for multiple shows, even bumping other acts to make room for him. The audience grew with each performance, and the Lowe's treated Elvis like family. Mrs. Lowe thought he was adorable, and the Lowe children, including a young Pat and Rob Jr., had their own experiences with the rising star. Pat, who was initially skeptical, eventually warmed up to Elvis, and Rob Jr., just 3 years old, became a mini-musician, playing his ukulele alongside Elvis on stage. Elvis's journey from a small-town singer to a national icon was just beginning, and the people of Joinerville, Alpine, and Lubbock were among the first to witness it. Elvis Presley's rise to fame was as wild and unpredictable as his performances. In a small town like Lubbock, Texas, even the most mundane things could turn into legends. One evening, before a show at the Cotton Club, Rob Sr. caught Pat, Rob, and Elvis drawing a tic-tac-toe board on the dining room tablecloth. Elvis, feeling guilty, slunk off to the show. The next day, when Rob Sr. found out it would cost $1.50 to clean the tablecloth, he decided it wasn't worth it and threw it away. Not long after, he regretted his decision, wishing he had kept the piece of history. Elvis's popularity grew so much that playing at the Cotton Club became too risky. Locals in Lubbock remembered him fondly, especially an incident where some fellows attacked him after a show at Fair Park. Elvis, with his quick reflexes, sent them back to Tupelo. The story spread quickly at Lee's Malt Bar and Grill, but it never left the town. Elvis kept in touch with the Lowe's, including Pat, who had a knack for sneaking boys into the Cotton Club. One of those boys was Buddy Holly, a local geek with a budding interest in music. Buddy's visits to the club were the start of something big. In 1955, Elvis's career was taking off. DJ Ernest Hackworth, known as Uncle Dudley, saw Elvis perform at the Louisiana Hayride and was impressed. Hackworth called his friend, Colonel Tom Parker, suggesting he check out this new talent. Parker, known for his extensive connections in the music industry, agreed to see Elvis perform. After a single performance, Parker knew he had found something special. Elvis's tour through West Texas in February 1955 was a whirlwind. At the Lubbock show, Slim Willett, a fellow musician, watched from backstage and was amazed by the audience's reaction. He called his friend Sid Foster in Breckenridge, telling him he had to see this guy. Foster attended the Abilene show at the Fair Park Auditorium and was equally impressed. When Elvis performed, the crowd went wild, and Foster knew he had to bring Elvis to Breckenridge. One night after the show, Elvis found himself trapped in a telephone booth by a group of teenage girls. He bravely signed autographs and kissed each girl before making his escape. Sid Foster watched the scene and laughed, knowing he had to get this kid to Breckenridge. The tour continued to Odessa, where Roy Orbison, a 15-year-old aspiring musician, watched Elvis perform. Roy was blown away by Elvis's energy and became an instant fan. He even interviewed Elvis later that year. Texarkana was another stop on the tour, and Elvis's performance there was unforgettable. The crowd was already hyped, and Elvis delivered. He swayed, jerked, and even performed his famous pelvic movements. The audience screamed, and Elvis threw his bow tie into the crowd, causing a frenzy. After the show, girls rushed backstage, hoping for more souvenirs. One brave fan even got Elvis to sign his shirt. In DeKalb, Texas, DJ Hackworth suggested a benefit concert to raise money for the Lions Club. The DeKalb football team was excited about the idea, but their coach was not. A heated argument between the coach and Morris Hodgson, a linebacker, ended in a physical altercation. The principal, J.D. Loggins, allowed the ticket sales to continue but banned any further fights. Elvis's impact on these small towns was profound. He wasn't just a performer, he was a symbol of the changing times, a blend of old and new, and a star on the rise. Elvis and the Blue Moon Boys arrived in Gainesville, Texas, revved up and ready to rock. They had just played a killer show in Breckenridge the night before, and the crowd's energy was still buzzing in their heads. But when they pulled up to the radio station KGAF, things didn't go as smoothly as they hoped. Elvis, Scotty, and Bill climbed out of their pink and white Cadillac, all dressed up in their stage outfits. Elvis straightened his orange and black jacket, slicked back his hair, and fluffed his sideburns. They walked up to the radio station, feeling confident. But the moment they approached, the station's chief engineer spotted them and panicked. "Lock the door, there are some hoodlum types outside," he yelled. The DJ took a look out the window and relaxed. "Oh, it's probably those guys who are going to play tonight," he said. The engineer felt a bit guilty and let them in. During the interview, Elvis, Scotty, and Bill were so polite and friendly that the engineer wished he hadn't been so scared. After the interview, they headed to the Kurtwood Motel to rest before the show. They were excited to play at Owl Park, a baseball field that had been set up for the concert. Flatbed trucks served as stages, and the bleachers were ready for a crowd. But as the night approached, the boys started to notice something was off. People were trickling in, but not nearly as many as they expected. By the time the show was supposed to start, fewer than 200 people were scattered in the stands. Elvis and the band felt a bit deflated, but they decided to give it their all anyway. They stepped onto the makeshift stage, and Elvis launched into his set. The small crowd was energized, but it wasn't the same as playing to a packed house. Elvis played his heart out, ripping chords on his guitar and dancing with his usual intensity. Scotty and Bill joined in, and they managed to get the audience moving. But despite their efforts, the atmosphere felt a bit flat. The boys finished their set and packed up their gear, feeling a mix of disappointment and exhaustion. As they drove away, Elvis couldn't help but wonder why some shows were a hit and others were a miss. He knew they had to keep pushing, no matter what. The next day, they had more gigs lined up, and they were determined to make the most of them. Even though Gainesville didn't turn out as they hoped, they knew they had something special, and they were going to keep rocking until the whole world knew it. Elvis and the Blue Moon Boys, Scotty and Bill, had a night they would never forget. On the evening of April 25th, 1955, they were booked to play at two different towns, Wichita Falls and Seymour, at the same time. They started at the MB Corral in Wichita Falls, but halfway through their set, they got a call from Seymour. The Seymour Volunteer Fire Department needed them to play a fundraiser at the high school auditorium. The fire department was counting on the money, and the town of 4,000 was waiting. Panicking, Elvis called his mom for advice. She suggested they do both shows. So, after a quick break, They left Wichita Falls in a hurry, hoping to make it to Seymour. But the Texas roads had other plans. Their car broke down outside a tiny town called Maybelle. The gas gauge read empty, and they were stranded. Stranded on a Texas road, they decided to hitchhike. Luckily, a car full of teenagers who had just left the MB Corral saw the pink Cadillac and stopped. The kids recognized Elvis and the band, and were more than happy to help. They dropped the band off in Seymour with extra gas, and got an autographed picture and a backstage pass as a thank you. When Elvis, Scotty, and Bill finally arrived at the Seymour High School auditorium, the volunteer firemen were relieved and grateful. They let the band get set up quickly, and despite being late, the show went on. The crowd was excited to see Elvis, and the fire department's fundraiser was saved. Elvis played his heart out, just like he always did, and the audience loved it. After the show, Elvis and the band chatted with the firemen and the teenagers who had helped them. They all felt like they had been part of something special. As Elvis drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He knew that no matter what, he had to keep his word and do his best, even when things got tough. The next day, Elvis and the band were back on the road, heading to their next gig. They had learned that sometimes the most memorable moments happen when you least expect them. And for Elvis, it was clear that no matter how big he got, he would always remember the small towns and the people who supported him, even on the craziest of nights.